The air in Biodome Gamma always smelled of wet earth, ozone, and the sweet, cloying perfume of the ghost orchids she'd coaxed to life 100 million miles from home. Dr. Eris Thorne drew in a slow breath, the familiar scent a balm against the sterile perfection of the Viridian outpost that surrounded her fragile world of green. Outside the triple-paned plasteel of the dome, the moon was a canvas of gray dust and black sky, its silence so profound it felt like a pressure against the ears. But in here, life hummed. Drones no larger than her thumb flitted between blossoms, their tiny electric wings a constant whisper, while the gurgle of the hydroponic system was a steady, reassuring heartbeat. Viridian wasn't a mining colony, a place of brutal extraction, but a project of creation, a testament to the stubborn human belief that life could be willed into existence anywhere, even on a rock orbiting a gas giant. Eris was a principal architect of that belief, a xenobotanist whose hands, tanned with chlorophyll and nutrient paste, were dedicated to the patient, sacred art of making things grow. She was adjusting the nutrient feed to a vine of sun scales, their crimson leaves unfurling to track the slow passage of the orbital lamps. When a shadow fell over her work, it wasn't the fleeting passage of a supply shuttle or the hulking form of the ore hauler that visited every 6 months. This shadow was different. It was graceful, silent, and it blotted out the artificial sun with the kind of finality that made the back of her neck prickle with a cold, primal dread. She looked up, her hand frozen above the vibrant leaves, and saw it through the dome's transparent ceiling. The ship was a thing of impossible beauty, shaped like a single, perfect teardrop cast from liquid gold. It descended without a sound, no roar of engines, no violent displacement of the thin atmosphere, settling onto the landing pad with the delicacy of a falling feather. There were no markings, no registry numbers, nothing to identify it as belonging to the Inter-System Alliance. The outpost's general alarm, a klaxon meant to shriek at the slightest hull breach or atmospheric failure, remained silent. Her comlink, usually buzzing with chatter from the geology team or the mess hall, was dead. The silence that had once been the peaceful backdrop to her life was now a suffocating shroud. Through the plasteel, she watched as a ramp extended from the golden teardrop, a seamless unfolding of metal that shimmered in the harsh starlight. The beings that emerged were as elegant and unsettling as their vessel. They were tall, impossibly slender, their forms encased in an iridescent armor that seemed to shift in color from silver to rose gold. They moved with a languid, unhurried grace, not like conquerors, but like curators entering a museum. They carried no visible weapons, yet their presence radiated an authority so absolute that the very air seemed to bend around them. Eris saw Elias Vance, the outpost's gruff but good-hearted security chief, stride out to meet them, his hand resting on the grip of his kinetic pistol in a gesture that was more nervous habit than genuine threat. He shouted something, his voice lost to the vacuum and the silence of her dome, but his posture was a mixture of confusion and defiance. One of the golden figures raised a hand, a long, three-fingered appendage, and a ripple of light, thin as a spider's thread, shot out and struck Elias. He didn't fall, he simply dissolved. One moment he was a man, solid and real. The next he was a cloud of shimmering dust that settled gently onto the gray regolith. There was no sound, no violence, just a quiet, horrifying erasure. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Eris's chest. She stumbled back from the viewport, her mind struggling to process the impossible thing she had just witnessed. These beings, the Aurelians as they would come to be known, didn't kill with the vulgar noise of human conflict. They unmade things with the quiet efficiency of gods. They flowed into the central hub of the outpost, their movements still unhurried, still graceful. They ignored the adults who stared, frozen in terror. They walked past the engineers at their consoles and the cooks in the mess hall as if they were nothing more than static displays. They were looking for something else. Eris watched on her security monitor, the feed miraculously still active, as they entered the common area, where the colony's 37 children were gathered for their morning lessons. The teacher, a young woman named Lena, stood in front of them, her body a trembling shield. The Aurelians paused, their featureless helmets tilting as they surveyed the small faces staring back at them. And then, with a chilling gentleness, they began to take them. They moved among the children, their touch delicate as they herded them toward the exit. The children didn't scream, not at first. They were too stunned, too mesmerized by the beautiful, terrifying figures before them. But then a little boy, Leo, the 6-year-old son of the lead geologist, began to cry. His sob, a tiny, broken sound, shattered the spell. The other children began to weep, their fear finally finding voice. That was when the parents broke. David, Leo's father, charged forward, a wrench gripped in his hand, his face a mask of primal fury. "Get away from my son," he roared, the sound tinny through the monitor's speaker. Just like with Elias, a golden figure raised its hand. The ripple of light was just as quick, just as silent. David dissolved into a cloud of glittering motes that mingled with the dust of the security chief. The children's cries turned to shrieks. The Aurelians paid them no mind, calmly guiding their small, weeping prizes out of the common area and back toward their golden ship. Something inside Eris snapped. The botanist, the patient creator, the woman who believed in the slow, sacred power of growth, died in that moment. Her grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight in her chest. But beneath it, something else was crystallizing. It was cold and hard and sharp. It was the scientific mind stripped of all morality, all empathy, all patience. It was the knowledge of life turned to a new and terrible purpose, the understanding of how to make things die. She looked around her laboratory, this sanctuary of life she had so carefully constructed, and saw it for the first time as an arsenal. The nutrient synthesizer could be recalibrated to produce neurotoxins. The pollination drones could be repurposed to deliver them. The accelerated growth promoters for the razor vine, a carnivorous plant she'd been studying under strict quarantine, could be weaponized. The very things she used to nurture life could be twisted into instruments of exquisite death. She had spent her life learning how the universe created. Now, she would teach it how to burn. Her hands, which had trembled with shock only moments before, were now perfectly steady. She moved to her console, her fingers flying across the holographic interface, the schematics for the outpost systems, the chemical composition of every compound in her lab, the biological data on the most lethal flora known to man. It all flowed through her mind, reconfiguring itself into a strategy not of survival, but of extermination. She bypassed the Aurelians' communication block with a simple, brute force override she'd designed for emergencies, sending a single encrypted message to the handful of colonists not in the central hub, the geology team out on a survey, the maintenance crew in the sublevels. The message was simple. They took the children. They are killing us. Go dark. Come to Gamma. Bring tool. We are going to make them pay. She then sealed the biodome, the thick blast doors sliding shut with a hiss and a heavy thud, isolating her sanctuary, her armory, from the silent horrors outside. As she worked, pulling canisters of concentrated alkaloids from a locked cabinet and setting the drones to swarm, she thought of Leo's father, A good man who had loved rocks and bad jokes, turning to dust for the crime of loving his child. The Aurelians had come to their world as gods, silent and beautiful and cruel. They had unmade a man for trying to protect his son. They had crossed a line that transcended species, a biological imperative so fundamental that violating it was a blasphemy against life itself. They thought humans were fragile, insignificant, a fleeting biological curiosity. They had been wrong. Eris picked up a pollination drone, its silver body cool in her palm, and began to modify its delivery nozzle, her movements precise and efficient. They had come to her garden, this tiny, fragile bubble of life, and they had taken the seeds. She would show them what kind of harvest they had sown. The heavy thud of the blast doors sealing Biodome Gamma was a sound of finality, a punctuation mark at the end of a world. For a long moment, Eris stood in the humming silence, the scent of orchids and wet soil a surreal counterpoint to the scentless, sterile death unfolding outside. The grief was still there, a cold, dense star in her chest, but her mind was now a place of crystalline clarity. The botanist was gone, her gentle curiosity replaced by the chilling precision of an executioner. She moved with an economy of motion she didn't know she possessed. Her lab, once a canvas for creation, now a rack of waiting instruments. She bypassed the safety protocols on the nutrient synthesizer, the machine's cheerful chime of confirmation sounding like a death knell as she keyed in the formula for a variant of botulinum, amplified and aerosolized. From the quarantine locker, she retrieved a sample of the razor vine, its serrated leaves coiling and uncoiling as if sensing her intent. Its native toxins were designed to paralyze its prey, to dissolve flesh into a digestible slurry. She began to extract the active compound, her hand steady as she titrated the clear, viscous liquid. She saw not a plant, but a delivery system. Every piece of equipment was reevaluated, its purpose inverted. The spectrograph used for analyzing soil composition could identify the precise resonant frequency to shatter the Aurelian's iridescent armor. The high-intensity growth lamps could be focused into a coherent beam, a crude but effective heat ray. She worked for what felt like hours, the world outside her sealed sanctuary ceasing to exist. There was only the task, the cold, clean mathematics of death. Then came the banging. It was a frantic, desperate rhythm against the outer airlock door. Eris froze, the pipette in her hand hovering over a vial of toxin. Her first instinct was suspicion, a new and ugly reflex. But the voice that came crackling over the airlock's local comm was ragged with human desperation. "Eris, it's Kalen. Let us in, for God's sake. Let us in." She moved to the control panel, her eyes scanning the external camera feed. Kalen, the outpost's chief engineer, was there, his face pale and smeared with grease. Behind him huddled 5 others, the last remnants of the survey and maintenance teams. Among them was Maya, a geologist whose face, usually etched with the patient calm of someone who thought in eons, was now a mask of hollow shock. Her 8-year-old daughter, Alara, had been in the classroom. Eris cycled the airlock, and they stumbled in, bringing with them the faint, metallic smell of fear. They looked around at her lab, their eyes wide with confusion. They saw the canisters lined up on the bench, the modified drones with their sharpened delivery nozzles, the schematic of an Aurelian, crudely sketched and annotated on a holographic display. "What is all this?" Kalen demanded, his voice shaking. He was a man of systems, of pipes and conduits. He understood pressure and tolerance, the predictable physics of a contained world. What he was seeing made no sense. "They took the children," Eris said, her voice flat. devoid of the emotion that was churning within the others. They are unmaking anyone who stands in their way. We are going to stop them. Kaelin let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Stop them, Ares. They're not real. They're like ghosts, like gods. They point a finger and you turn to dust. We saw it happen to the security team at the comms tower. We need to hide. We need to find a way to call for help. Help is 3 months away. Maya whispered, her voice a raw nerve. She was staring at the razor vine extract, her gaze distant and dead. 3 months. She didn't need to finish the sentence. The unspoken horror of what could happen to their children in 3 months hung in the air, thicker than the humid, oxygen-rich atmosphere of the dome. She's right, Eris said, turning to face them. She wasn't a commander. She had no authority over these people, but in her cold certainty, they saw the only alternative to absolute despair. Hiding is a delayed death. Waiting is a betrayal. They have a biology. I saw it. When they unmake us, there is a discharge, a cascade of energy that breaks down molecular bonds. That requires a biological process. And any biological process can be corrupted. It can be poisoned. She pointed to the drones now lined up in a neat row, their silver bodies glinting. These were designed to pollinate the ghost orchids. Their navigational systems are precise to the millimeter. I have filled them with a neurotoxin derived from the nightshade root. It is fast-acting. It attacks the nervous system at a cellular level. They are not gods, Kaelin. They are organisms, and I am going to introduce them to a pest they did not anticipate. The engineer stared at her, his face a battleground of disbelief and a desperate, flickering hope. You're talking about murder. Eris. They murdered David for trying to save his son, she countered, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. They murdered Elias for asking them a question. This is not murder. This is pest control. It was Maya who broke the stalemate. She walked over to the workbench and picked up one of the modified drones, holding it in her palm. Show me how it works, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Her grief had found a new shape, hardening from a passive agony into an active, burning need for retribution. Her resolve was the catalyst. The others, seeing the geologist's fire, began to stir. A quiet, grim determination settled over the small group. Kaelin, a man who needed a problem to solve, finally nodded. The main ventilation shafts have service tunnels running alongside them, he said, his practical mind taking over. They run throughout the entire outpost. I can get your Serpes anywhere you need them to be. Their first target was a lone Aurelian standing guard by the entrance to the central hub. It was a test, a proof of concept. They watched on a security feed Eris had spliced, the image grainy and unstable. The Aurelian stood perfectly still, a sculpture of rose gold and silver, its elegant form a stark contrast to the utilitarian corridors of the outpost. From a ceiling vent, a single drone emerged, then another, and another, a tiny, silent swarm. They descended upon the Aurelian, their movements too small, too fast to be easily perceived. For a second, nothing happened. The golden figure remained immobile. Kaelin started to shake his head, a look of grim vindication on his face. And then, the Aurelian twitched. It was a small, unnatural movement, a spasming in its slender limbs. The iridescent armor flickered, its colors shifting wildly. The being brought a hand to its chest, not in pain, but in what looked like confusion, as if trying to understand a sensation it had never before experienced. It took a stumbling step, its perfect grace gone, replaced by a clumsy, jarring gait. Then it fell. It didn't dissolve. It didn't turn to dust. It crashed to the metal floor with a solid to heavy impact, the sound of its armored body hitting the deck echoing faintly through the monitor's speaker. It lay there, convulsing, its limbs twitching as the neurotoxin did its work. The light in its armor dimmed, faded, and went out. In the biodome, the 6 survivors stared at the screen, at the corpse of the thing they had been told was a god. It was a messy, biological death. It was alien, but it was undeniably the death of a living creature. A profound, terrifying silence filled the dome. The unassailable, untouchable beauty of the Aurelians had been shattered. They were not ethereal beings of light and dust. They could be broken. They could be killed. They could bleed. Eris watched the twitching form on the screen until it was finally still, her face an unreadable mask. The grief in her chest hadn't lessened, but the cold star at its center now burned with the absolute certainty of a supernova. This was just the beginning. She had proven they were mortal. Now, she would prove they could be erased. The image on the monitor of the still, broken thing on the corridor floor held them in a state of suspended animation. The silence in the biodome was no longer peaceful. It was the sound of a Rubicon being crossed. They had killed one. The knowledge was a poison and a tonic, a source of profound horror and a searing ray of hope. Maya was the first to move. Her eyes, which had been dead pools of grief, now burned with a terrifying light. "How many drones do we have?" she asked, her voice raspy, brittle. "How much of that stuff can you make?" The question was a spark in the volatile atmosphere. Kalen looked from the screen to Eris, his face pale. "We can't just go on an attack. Maya, we don't know how many there are. We don't know how they'll react." Eris silenced him with a look. She was already thinking past the single kill, her mind a cold engine of logic, processing variables and threat responses. "Kalen is right," she said, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "That was a test, a lone guard, isolated. They will have noted its absence by now. They will adapt. The same trick will not work twice. We need to escalate." She walked to the central schematic of the Viridian outpost, a shimmering holographic projection that hung in the air above a console. With a few gestures, she stripped away the layers showing crew quarters and recreation areas, leaving only the station's lifeblood, the network of ventilation shafts, atmospheric processors, and power conduits. We can't hunt them one by one. We have to make the entire outpost hostile to them. Kalen's eyes widened as he understood. "The atmospheric scrubbers," he breathed. "The main intake is less than 50 meters from here. Oh, if you could create a gaseous version of your toxin, a large enough quantity, we could pump it into the entire station's air supply. It would be everywhere, in every room, every corridor." It was a monstrous idea, a plan of such totality that it bordered on madness. They would be turning their own home into a gas chamber. "We would be safe in here," Kalen continued, his engineer's mind now racing, catching fire with the sheer audacity of the problem. "The biodome has its own closed-loop environmental system. We could seal it off completely, but the rest of the station, it would become a tomb. They're not breathing our air." One of the maintenance techs, a young man named Ben, pointed out, his voice trembling. "Their suits, they must have their own supply." Eris turned from the schematic, her expression grim. "That is the first problem we need to solve. Their armor is not just protection. It's a self-contained environment. It is not a perfect system. It must have points of failure, seams, vents, filtration units for trace elements. If we can identify them, we can tailor the delivery agent, make the toxin molecules small enough, reactive enough, to bypass their filtration. She looked at the dead Aurelian on the monitor. To do that, she said, her voice dropping, I need the body. A new kind of fear settled on the group, eating the sealed safety of the biodome, which had become their entire world, felt like stepping off a cliff. The short journey to the fallen Aurelian was a traverse through a landscape of dread. They moved in a tight cluster down the sterile white corridors, every shadow a potential threat, every flicker of the emergency lighting a jolt to the nerves. Kaylin had managed to disable the main surveillance system, but they moved with the constant, prickling certainty that they were being watched by unseen, featureless faces. They found the Aurelian where it had fallen. Up close, it was both less and more terrifying. Less, because it was undeniably a physical object, its armor scarred and dented from the fall, the elegant lines now just a shell. More, because its stillness felt profoundly wrong, an interruption of the effortless grace that had defined it. Under Eris's direction, they worked to move it. The body was heavier than it looked, a dead weight of alien metal and biology. As they lifted it onto a service cart, Maya's hand brushed against a seam near the creature's neck. A faint, almost imperceptible hiss escaped, and a single drop of fluid, thick and the color of amethyst, welled up and dripped onto the floor. It sizzled, eating a small, dark pit into the composite decking. They all recoiled, a collective gasp of horror. Their enemy bled acid. Back in the relative safety of the lab, a new, more chilling task began. Eris turned a section of her botany lab into a makeshift morgue, the scent of orchids now mingling with the sharp, acrid odor of the alien's internal fluids. The others watched from a distance as she worked under a sterile containment field, her face illuminated by the harsh glare of a surgical lamp. She began with the armor, using a plasma cutter from Kaylin's toolkit to carefully slice through the iridescent shell. The material was a complex, layered composite, a fusion of metal and crystalline structures that seemed to absorb and redirect the energy of the cutter. It took nearly an hour to make the first incision. What they saw underneath silenced them all. The creature within was not a being of golden light. It was a frail, emaciated thing, its body long and disturbingly humanoid in its basic structure, but its skin was a pale, translucent white, shot through with dying, black veins. It was tethered to the inside of the suit by a web of crystalline conduits that pulsed with a faint, violet light. The armor wasn't just a suit, it was a sarcophagus. A life support system for a dying organism. They're ancient, Eris murmured, her voice amplified by the comm in her helmet. Look at the cellular degradation. The telomeres are frayed to almost nothing. This isn't a warrior, it's a relic. As she delved deeper, she made the discovery that changed everything. Within the creature's chest cavity, nestled among withered organs, was a small biosynthetic pouch. Inside it, suspended in a nutrient gel, was a fragment of a DNA helix. Eris ran a quick sequence analysis, her fingers a blur on the console. The results flashed on the screen, and a wave of nausea washed over her. It was human. Specifically, it was a child's. The sequence was incomplete, fragmented, but it contained markers for rapid cell growth, for the robust, unspecialized potential found only in the very young. They're not killing them, Maya breathed, her voice cracking as she stared at the screen, her hand covering her mouth. They're harvesting them. Eris looked up from the corpse, her eyes meeting Maya's over the containment field. The cold precision in her expression was gone, replaced by a horror so profound it was almost a physical blow. Their own genetic code is collapsing. Eris explained, her voice a strained whisper. They're dying out. They're trying to splice our children's regenerative capabilities, their genetic vitality, into their own genome. They're not conquerors. They're parasites. They're grave robbers, trying to steal life from our cradles to keep their own tombs from sealing shut. The revelation was worse than any simple act of malice. This wasn't cruelty. It was a desperate, biological imperative. The children weren't hostages to be bargained for. They were raw material. And the clock was ticking. Every moment that passed, their children were being unmade, not by a beam of light, but cell by cell in the belly of that golden, silent ship. The debate was over. The morality of their plan evaporated in the face of this new, terrible truth. Kalen went straight to the environmental controls, his face set in a grim mask. Maya stood by the main viewport of the dome, her gaze fixed on the golden teardrop ship, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Eris returned to the nutrient synthesizer, no longer an executioner, but a surgeon excising a cancer. She worked with a renewed, terrifying fury, formulating a compound that would not just kill, but scour. A toxin that would be drawn to the specific energy signature of the Aurelians' life support, that would use their own failing biology against them, turning their crystalline lifeblood into the same acidic poison that had eaten through the floor. The plan was no longer just an attack. It was a rescue. A desperate, impossible, all-or-nothing gamble. Eris loaded the final, milky white payload into the atomizer connected to the main air intake. Kalen stood with his hand hovering over the activation panel for the station's ventilation system. He looked at Eris, his eyes asking the final question. Eris gave a single, sharp nod. Kalen's hand fell, and with a deep, shuddering hum that vibrated through the very structure of the outpost, their world began to fill with poison. The hum was the only sound. It was a deep, resonant thrum that came from the ventilation shafts, the sound of their home's own lungs delivering a fatal poison. For 10 minutes, the 6 survivors stood clustered around the security monitors in Biodome Gamma, a silent tableau of ghosts watching a dying world. The air in the dome was thick with the scent of ghost orchids, a funereal sweetness that now seemed grotesquely inappropriate. No one spoke. Words were useless things against the enormity of what they had done, of what they were waiting for. Maya stood rigid, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of a console, her eyes locked on the monitor showing the corridor outside the main common area. Kalen's gaze darted between a pressure gauge for the ventilation system and the grainy images on the screens, a bead of sweat tracing a path through the grease on his temple. He was a man of predictable systems, and he had just unleashed chaos. Eris alone seemed calm, her posture still, her eyes moving with a slow, methodical rhythm from one monitor to the next. She was an observer, a scientist watching her hypothesis unfold, her face betraying nothing of the maelstrom of grief and rage that had set this experiment in motion. Then it happened. On screen 3, which showed a view of the geology lab, an Aurelian that had been examining rock samples with an unnerving stillness suddenly flinched. Its head, a featureless golden ovoid, snapped to the side. It took a clumsy, shuffling step, its innate grace completely gone. The iridescent armor began to flicker, cycling through a frantic spectrum of colors, from rose gold to a sickly, bruised purple. A dark, wet patch appeared at a seam on its shoulder, and a thin wisp of acrid smoke curled towards the ceiling. The creature raised a hand to its own chest, its long fingers splaying out as if in surprise, and then it crumpled, folding in on itself like a paper doll thrown into a fire. It landed on the floor in a heap of corroded armor and withering flesh, the sizzling of its own acidic blood the only sound. A choked sob escaped Ben, the young tech. He turned away from the screen, his face ashen, but Maya leaned closer, her breath fogging the monitor, her eyes wide and unblinking. It was happening on other screens now. In the mess hall, 2 Aurelians who had been standing over the empty tables dropped within seconds of each other. In the primary airlock, another collapsed against the outer door, its failing body leaving a long, black smear down the plasteel. They were dying. Eris's plague, delivered on the very air of the station, was working. It was a silent, efficient slaughter. The Aurelians offered no resistance. They didn't cry out. They didn't fire their strange as dissolving weapons. Their response to the poison was one of quiet, systemic failure. Their advanced, ancient bodies, already brittle with age, had no defense against the tailored savagery of Eris's toxin. The crystalline conduits that sustained them were shattering. Their life support suits were becoming acid-filled coffins, and the relics within were simply stopping. The station they had so gracefully and effortlessly conquered was now their tomb. For an hour, the survivors watched the cascade. The grim satisfaction they expected to feel never came. There was no triumph in it, only a deep, chilling horror at the effectiveness of their own work. They were watching the end of a species, a final, messy extinction event playing out in the corridors of their home, and they were its cause. When the last visible Aurelian on the monitors had fallen and lay still, a new kind of silence descended upon the biodome. The hum of the vents was no longer a promise of death, but a reminder of the poisoned air that now separated them from the rest of the station. They had won. The outpost was theirs again. But the children were not there. All eyes turned to the main viewport, to the single, massive screen that showed the world outside. The golden teardrop ship sat on the landing pad, untouched, pristine, its hull shimmering under the cold, distant starlight. It was a silent, beautiful monument to their incomplete victory. The children were in there, behind that perfect, seamless hull. Their plan had been a success, but also a catastrophic failure. They had secured the prison, but not the prisoners. They're still in the ship, Maya whispered, her voice a thread of sound. The fire in her eyes had cooled to a desperate, aching dread. The air, it wouldn't have reached them in there. The ship will have its own atmospheric processors, a closed system just like this dome, Kalen confirmed, his voice heavy. It's isolated. They're safe from the toxin in there, but so are the children. They were at an impasse. 6 survivors in a sealed lab, separated from their goal by a few hundred meters of vacuum and an alien hull they had no conceivable way of breaching. The weight of their hollow victory pressed down on them. They had committed an act of total extermination, only to fail at the one thing that mattered. And then the ship began to glow. It started as a soft, internal luminescence, a gentle pulse of golden light from deep within its core. But it grew steadily in intensity, the hull shifting from a reflective gold to a radiant, self-generating brilliance. A low hum, deeper and more powerful than the sound from the vents, began to vibrate through the biodome's floor, a tremor that resonated in their bones. Kalen stumbled over to a long-range sensor suite, his hands flying across the console. "What is that? What are they doing?" Maya demanded, her voice rising with panic. Kalen's face went slack with disbelief. He stared at the energy readings, his mouth opening and closing silently before he found his voice. "It's the drive core," he said, his words barely audible. "The energy output, it's exponential. They're not powering up to leave. They're deliberately overloading it. He turned to face them, his eyes wide with a new and final horror. It's not a self-destruct. A bomb is too small, too quick. They're destabilizing the singularity that powers the ship. When it goes critical, it won't just explode. It will create a short-lived star. It will be hot enough to fuse the regolith into glass. It won't just destroy the station, it will vaporize this entire side of the moon. The Aurelian's final act was not one of retreat, but of spite. It was the last, desperate move of a dying species. A final, cosmic tantrum. If they could not have the genetic material to save their race, then they would deny it to their enemy. They would burn the cradle, the children, and their killers in the fires of a newborn sun. The energy readings on Kaylin's console climbed with terrifying speed. A countdown clock, not of numbers, but of rising energy levels, was ticking towards an inevitable, incandescent end. How long, Eris asked, her voice cutting through the panic, as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. Kaylin didn't take his eyes off the screen. I don't know. The physics are insane. Minutes. An hour at most. There's no stopping it from out here. Minutes. They had minutes to cross a vacuum, breach an impervious alien vessel that was actively turning itself into a star, and rescue 37 children from the heart of the inferno. The impossibility of the task was absolute. The cold, hard shell of Eris's fury finally cracked, not in fear, but in a surge of pure, defiant rage. She had not come this far. She had not sacrificed her own humanity on the altar of vengeance, just to watch them burn. She strode to the viewport, staring down the glowing golden vessel, her reflection a pale, determined ghost against the impossible light. They are not winning, she growled, more to the universe than to the broken people behind her. She turned, her eyes sweeping over them, her gaze locking with Maya's. The shared, unspoken promise to bring their children home, a promise made in the silent language of grief, now faced its final, impossible test. Kaylin, she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority forged in the crucible of their shared nightmare. That body, the armor. Is there a way to open their ship from the outside Kaylin's hands, which could coax life from the station's most recalcitrant machinery, trembled as they hovered over the dead Aurelian's armored gauntlet? The plasma cutter, set to its finest point, whined like a nervous insect, casting a frantic, dancing light across his face shield. It's not just a lock and key, he breathed, his voice a tight, strained wire over the private comm channel. Their technology, it's biological, symbiotic. The ship won't respond to a signal or a frequency. It needs to feel the unique biosignature of one of its own. It needs a handshake, a living pulse. We can't fake that, not in the time we have. His words were a death sentence, the final, insurmountable wall. Outside, the world was turning to fire, the hum of the overloading drive core a rising crescendo that vibrated through the very soles of their boots. The biodome, their sanctuary, was becoming an oven, its internal temperature climbing degree by agonizing degree. Despair, thick and suffocating, settled over the small group of survivors. It was the end. They had committed genocide for nothing. But Maya stepped forward, her movement stiff in the bulky EVA suit. The grief in her eyes, which had been a hollowed-out void, had been forged by the mounting heat into a diamond-hard point of resolve. Her gaze was locked on the alien gauntlet, on the elegant, three-fingered hand that had been designed to steal her child. "Then we won't fake it," she said, her voice eerily calm, the words slicing through the rising panic. "We won't replicate it. We will appropriate it." A chilling silence followed her words as the grotesque implication settled upon them all. Eris looked from Maya's unyielding face to Kaylin's horrified one, and she understood. It was a monstrous, blasphemous idea, but in a world that had turned to monstrous blasphemy, it was also the only path forward. Kaylin, Eris commanded, her voice sharp, leaving no room for argument. Can you sever the gauntlet at the wrist, isolate its internal power source, and bridge it to one of our own battery packs? Can you make that dead hand live again for 5 minutes? Kaylin stared at the alien tech, then at Maya's outstretched, human hand waiting to be fitted with the macabre prosthesis. The engineer in him saw a systems problem of impossible complexity and perverse elegance. The man in him recoiled, but he looked at Maya's eyes and saw the reflection of the burning ship, and he knew there was no other choice. He gave a single, sharp nod. The power regulation will be a nightmare, he said, his professionalism a thin shield against the horror of the task. But the principle is sound. I can try. The next 10 minutes were a lifetime of desperate, focused insanity, while the others donned the remaining EVA suits, their movements clumsy with haste. Kaylin worked with a terrifying precision. He carved through the iridescent armor, severing the gauntlet with a shower of alien sparks. He bypassed the creature's dead biology, splicing the crystalline power fibers into the raw, brutal energy of a human-made lithium-ion cell. The gauntlet pulsed with a faint, stolen light, its elegant fingers twitching as if in a dream. Then came the final, awful act. He grafted the monstrous appendage onto the wrist of Maya's EVA suit, locking it into place over her own hand. She stood perfectly still throughout the procedure, her face a pale, determined mask behind her visor, her own fingers curling into a fist within the cold. Alien shell? She was no longer just Maya, the geologist, that she was a key, a mother wearing the hand of the enemy to break down its door. The three of them, Eris in the lead, Maya, with her terrible new appendage held stiffly at her side, and Kaylin, his toolkit slung over his shoulder, cycled through the airlock. The moment the outer door slid open, the heat was a physical blow, a solid wall of force that staggered them. The golden ship was no longer a thing of beauty. It was a miniature sun, a seething, incandescent ball of pure energy. The gray regolith of the landing pad was glowing a molten, cherry red, and the station itself was groaning, metal plates buckling and warping under the strain. They ran, three lumbering figures in white, sprinting across a landscape that was actively melting into hellfire. The light was a physical pressure, so blinding that their helmet visors polarized to absolute black, turning the world into a stark, terrifying negative. They reached the base of the ship, the seamless hull radiating a heat that made the air in their suits feel thin and scorching. Maya moved forward, her steps a testament to sheer maternal will. She reached out with her augmented arm and pressed the palm of the Aurelian gauntlet flat against the glowing hull. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, nothing happened. The ship continued its terrible, rising hum, the countdown in its core racing towards its inevitable, fiery conclusion. Then, a section of the hull before them rippled like water. The golden light swirled into a perfect, silent archway, and with a fluid motion that defied the chaos around it, a ramp extended to their feet. They plunged inside without a second's hesitation. The transition was a sensory shock. The inferno outside vanished, replaced by a cool, silent, and softly lit interior. They stood in a single vast chamber that spiraled gently upwards, the walls themselves emanating a gentle, ambient gold. It was a cathedral, a tomb, a silent, sterile monument to a dying race. And in the center of that chamber, arranged like specimens in a perverse museum, were 37 stasis pods. Inside each shimmering, transparent cylinder, a child floated in a pale, glowing gel, their faces peaceful in a chemically induced slumber. Their small bodies were tethered by a network of fine, crystalline threads to a central conduit that pulsed with a soft, violet light. It was a garden of stolen life, each child a cutting being prepared for a harvest that would never come. As they rushed toward the pods, a figure rose to meet them from the base of the central conduit. It was the last Aurelian. Its armor was dull and scarred, its movements slow and pained. It was not merely standing there, it was fused to the machinery of the ship, a web of the same crystalline threads that held the children, connecting its own dying body to the overloading core. It was the pilot, the heart, and the final vengeful will of its species. It raised a hand, and a shimmering barrier of energy flickered into existence, enveloping the pods. "You cannot have them," a voice echoed, not through the air, but directly inside their minds. It was a sound of dry leaves and infinite weariness, the voice of a being that had watched stars die. "They are our last hope. In their vitality, we will be reborn. You will burn with them." Eris projected back, her own thoughts a blade of pure, concentrated fury. "This is over. Let them go." The Aurelian's mental voice was filled with a chilling, ancient sorrow. "For us, it has been over for 10,000 years. This is not an ending. It is a final, defiant act of creation. It is better to burn than to fade into nothing." Kalen was already at the energy barrier, his plasma cutter spitting a useless stream of superheated particles against it. The Aurelian was channeling the ship's overloading core directly into the shield. As long as it was connected, they were locked out. Eris saw the terrible, necessary truth in a flash of cold clarity. She looked at Maya, and in the reflection of their visors, a final, unspoken understanding passed between them. They had not come this far to fail. Eris turned, raised her own plasma cutter, and fired. Her target was not the shield, but the central conduit where the last Aurelian was fused to its ship. The beam struck the crystalline structure with explosive force, shattering it. The Aurelian let out a silent, mental scream that tore through their minds, a sound of pure agony and loss. The energy barrier around the pods flickered, sputtered, and died. At the same time, the light in the stasis pods turned from a gentle, violet glow to a flashing, critical red. "Get them now," Eris roared, her voice raw in their comms. They swarmed the bank of pods, smashing the emergency release controls with their fists and tools. The cylinders hissed open, and the children, limp and disoriented, began to float free from the gel. They worked in a frantic, desperate ballet, grabbing small or weightless bodies, securing them with emergency tethers to their suits. The ship began to shudder violently around them, the golden light of the walls strobing erratically, the hum rising to a deafening, structural shriek. They fled, a strange, makeshift family of astronauts and sleeping children, back down the spiraling ramp and out into the waiting inferno. The heat was a solid wall now, the ground itself a sea of molten rock. As they stumbled back toward the distant, shimmering sanctuary of the biodome, the golden ship behind them began to shine with the light of 1,000 suns. They threw themselves through the outer airlock, a chaotic, tangled pile of bodies and suits, as Ben, his face a mask of terror and relief, slammed the emergency cycle. As the inner door irised open, Eris looked back through the thick, radiation-shielded plasteel. The world went white. There was no sound, only a silent, absolute, and all-consuming light that erased everything. The biodome screamed, its superstructure groaning under a shockwave that felt like the hand of a vengeful god. And then, silence. The light faded. Outside, where the landing pad, the outpost, and the golden teardrop ship had been, there was only a new, vast crater of gleaming black glass, a permanent, obsidian scar on the face of the moon. The emergency lights flickered on inside the dome. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and sweet, cloying orchids. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, another sound joined the steady, reassuring hum of the hydroponics, the soft, sleepy cry of a waking child. Maya was on her knees, her helmet off, the monstrous Aurelian gauntlet discarded on the floor beside her. She cradled Ilara in her arms, her tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her face as she buried her face in her daughter's hair. Iris stood apart, her hands trembling, her body a canvas of aches and burns. She looked at the children, at the impossible, fragile life they had pulled from the heart of a dying star. She was no longer a botanist, a creator, a nurturer of life. She had poisoned an atmosphere, engineered a plague, and stood as the sole witness and architect of the extinction of a species. But here, in her garden, at the very edge of the abyss, life was growing again. The cost had been a part of her soul, a piece of her humanity she knew she would never get back. But as she watched a mother kiss her child's sleeping face, she knew, with a certainty that was both terrible and true, that she would pay it again.